Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our public lecture series on the Wisconsin idea, past and present. If you're a regular at this series, then you know that this lecture series is part of a new course taught for the first time this fall under the auspices of the Department of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My name is Chad Allen Goldberg. I'm a professor in the Sociology Department, and I have the honor to serve as the instructor for the course this semester. The Wisconsin idea has always been about more than training students for the workforce. It meant, as Adlai Stevenson once put it, a faith in the application of intelligence and reason to the problems of society, the aspiration to light the way of Wisconsin's citizens and government with the best torches of knowledge and understanding that their university can provide. Accordingly, this lecture series and the course with which it is associated aim to bring students, staff, and faculty throughout the UW system into a broad conversation with the citizens of the state about how the knowledge produced at the University of Wisconsin has benefited the public in the past and can continue to do so today. I encourage you to participate actively through our course website, www.wiskidea.com, and our Facebook page. If you are live tweeting this or subsequent lectures, please use the hashtag WiskIdea. The Sociology Department is offering this course with limited resources from our academic and our supplies and expenses budget. If you would like to contribute to this project to allow us to offer real-time broadcasts or otherwise improve our offerings this semester or in the future, please consider making a contribution to the Department of Sociology Annual Fund. You can do that through the course website. Before I introduce our panel of speakers tonight, I do want to remind you that we have program evaluations for folks to fill out. It's voluntary, but we would appreciate your input and feedback. If you did this last week, there's not really a need to do it again unless you want to do it specifically on this lecture, which we encourage. If you haven't done it last week, we encourage you to pick one of these up. You'll find them in the last row. In the back, there's a stack of them. You can grab them on your way out. And this just asks for your comments and input so that we can improve this when we offer this lecture series again in the future. We are fortunate to continue our lecture series tonight with a panel discussion on lived religion in Wisconsin, featuring Corrie E. Norman, Jordan D. Rosenblum, and Susan B. Ridgley. Like all of our speakers, they are graciously donating their time and expertise free of charge out of a commitment to public service. Dr. Corrie E. Norman is Associate Director of Religious Studies here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the author of 2 books and numerous articles on religion and culture in American and comparative contexts. She served as a faculty member, department chair, and administrator in several institutions and on the board of the American Academy of Religion. With her students, she mapped lived religion among new immigrant communities in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, and is initiating a similar undergraduate research project here, Lived Religion in Wisconsin. Dr. Jordan D. Rosenblum is Associate Professor and the Belzer Professor of Classical Judaism. He is the Director of the Religious Studies Program and the Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Comparative Literature and Folklore Studies. The author of 2 books, Food and Identity and Early Rabbinic Judaism, published by Cambridge University Press in 2010, and The Jewish Dietary Laws in the Ancient World, published by Cambridge University Press, forthcoming, well, I guess it's actually out this month, December 2016, so it just came out. Professor Rosenblum's research focuses on the literature, culture, law, and history of the rabbinic movement. He also teaches a range of courses that take him out of the classical world, or rather bring insights from the classical world into present-day Wisconsin, particularly in the lived religion of contemporary Jews, gender, sexuality, and law. Dr. Susan B. Ridgley is Visiting Associate Professor of Religious Studies. She is a specialist in religion in the United States, pioneering ethnographic research with, rather than simply on, children. Before coming to Madison, she was on the faculty at UW-Oshkosh, where she researched lived religion in the area. Author of 3 books on American religion and culture, her most recent is Practicing What the Doctor Preached at Home with Focus on the Family, published by Oxford University Press in 2016, this year. It draws on interviews with mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters to explore how actual families put into practice the conservative Christian child-rearing principles of James Dobson, the founder of Focus on the Family. Professor Ridgley is teaching a seminar on religion and the election this term. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speakers, Corrie E. Norman, Jordan D. Rosenblum, and Susan B. Ridgley.
Thanks. We're hoping to make this a bit informal and interactive. We didn't bring any fancy PowerPoints. We hope to continue a conversation that we really have among ourselves and among our students, some of whom are here tonight. I see some of my majors in religious studies, and I also see a number of my students from our gateway course, Religion and Sickness and Health, which I teach this term. So those are the maybe unfamiliar faces, those of you who've been in this course all along. Will be seeing. I wish I'd been able to be here with you all along for two reasons. One is I find this topic fascinating, and I would love to hear your insights into it and more about what you've learned this term. And two is it really would have helped me prepare tonight if I knew more about what you'd already done. Chad has helped to inform us about that, and I have gotten some information from some of you in the class. Thank you to Lauren, who I hope to meet at some point here, and a few others who answered a question that I put to Chad very early in the term, or took on an exercise that I had given early in the term, which was to think about religion and listen out for it throughout this term. And so those comments are going to inform what I have to say tonight. I'm not going to talk largely about my projects in lived religion in Wisconsin. I'd like to tell you more about that, and hopefully there'll be time for that in the questions, which we hope to have a good bit of time for question and comment after we make some initial remarks. But I thought it might be important to talk about what religious studies is, because I don't take it for granted that people know that. And we don't help you out a whole lot with it either, because religious studies is a pretty confusing title. It sounds like we're religiously studying, or we're religious who study. I'm not sure what it is, and I didn't make that one up, okay? That was handed to me, and it's actually not a Wisconsin thing. It's common in many institutions. But let me start this way with this disclaimer. We're not necessarily religious. Some of us who do religious studies may be religious, but that's not a prerequisite. What we do is study about those things that we call religious, and sometimes even things that we don't call so directly religious. We focus on what matters to people, and we look for that. We look for evidence of that in the way that they use resources around them to orient their lives. Those may be overt religious things, symbols, sacred spaces, or they may be a little patch I know about in the middle of the cornfields of Greene County, where some folks who used to work in cubicles all day in Chicago decided to go and figure out how to live their lives. And they have a little ritual spot out there that they're creating their own rituals in. It varies widely what we look at here. But it's all really about what matters to people, what they tell us, and what we can derive from their activities and what they create. We are interdisciplinary. Religious studies has many ways of trying to examine religion, but that is what we do. We focus on approaching this large, unruly topic, and that is largely what we aim to teach our students to do. First of all, to pay attention and recognize it. Second of all, to figure out how to classify it in ways that help us understand what's happening. Third of all, to look at how it functions for people in groups, for people individually, and for people in societies. We also focus a lot on skills. Listen, if you can give an elevator speech about what religious studies is and why you convinced your parents that you could major in it at UW-Madison today, you can talk about anything. And that's what we help our students try to do. We also hope that we give them something else, and this is an aim of ours. It's a kind of perception, an ability to have insight into people and into groups of people to listen very closely to how people talk about things, the words they use, to think about where those words come from. When somebody says, "Make America great," when somebody says, "Keep hope alive," that's the stuff of the study of religion, because it's the stuff of how people talk about what matters to them or how they hope to motivate other people. We are an undergraduate program. I am so proud of that here at UW, because we are a Research One institution where we focus a lot on graduate education, which is great. But we focus on the education of undergraduates. That is, those are folks who, by and large, in our study, in our program, are not going to go out and be replicas of us. They're going to go out and they're going to be, well, nurses, teachers, social workers. Whatever they go out to be, we hope they're going to be people who, when they hear it, see it, smell it, taste it even, are going to recognize the impact of religion in our society. So that's a bit about what religious studies is. And I want to put in one more thing. So we do a lot with approaches. We do a lot with recognition. We also focus, of course, on religions. We focus on something that our society is woefully bad at right now, which is religious literacy. Simply understanding where things come from. I mean, the joke I make is even the religious fundamentalists I know don't know the Bible verses anymore. They misquote them all the time. Who's going to check up on that, right? So it's really approaches, content knowledge, and those kinds of perceptions, and ability to communicate with folks who may not think the same way you do. Over these very difficult issues. So where does religion and where does religious studies connect to the Wisconsin idea? Well, I think there have been a couple of direct connections that I've heard about in your class. And the first one is in religious studies, how you get a religious studies term here, is in the cosmology of the Wisconsin idea. John Bascom had a religious motivation when we first start understanding the emergence of this thing that we'll come to call the Wisconsin idea. But it came out of a particular kind of religious milieu and a particular kind of worldview. I was taken by the speaker and by the book on Bascom that I think you all had access to, and the way that he moved, shifted, flowed with various lines of thought to create something that I wouldn't say is unique, but something that is rather particular, and particular to a context in which progressivism in its social and political forms and a particular kind of religion, liberal Protestantism, come together. And so it bears thinking about that this university, this state university, in some ways owes much of its philosophical background and thus its construction to the conjoining of religion and other social movements. In that, I think, there's something else worth bearing in mind, that that particular form of religion that Bascom came to see as a kind of way of undergirding education for citizenry was formed over against other types of religion, other ways of thinking of religion. It's a kind of moral philosophizing that Bascom does. And it leaves out some things that are pretty important when we try to think about the broad range of religion. I wonder sometimes if that ancient history doesn't somehow still affect the way we think about religion and its role today in the academy, and even the study of it in the academy. Because that moral underpinning, that kind of sobriety, quite literally in Bascom's case, since he was a temperance guy, that kind of sobriety over the course, and perhaps ironically, of the development of academia in time, came to meet a kind of rejection. And in some ways, I think we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. It's very interesting. UW-Madison has a quite interesting, in its, the study of religion here has a quite interesting peculiarity. Most institutions, public and private, that had a kind of very strong religious agenda in their development, when they come to develop an academic study of religion, they have a long, decades-long, some even still, decades-long struggle separating that kind of Protestant moralism of the 19th century from the study of religion. UW-Madison pretty much separated it right out. For instance, we've never had a hegemony of Protestantism here since. We've never even had a professor of the study of New Testament and Christianity here. Many institutions with departments of religions are virtually start out as kind of theology departments, morph into a department dominated by the study of Christianity, and then eventually, and still struggle, to add other religions into the mix. That hadn't happened at UW-Madison. We don't have a department of religion, we have a program. Most departments of religion in the United States began to emerge in the 1960s. The program in religious studies did not emerge at UW-Madison until 1998. Says something particular, I think, about a long historical context here. Something else I wanted to note is where religion does emerge then very directly in this class is in another kind of thing that I think is very important to keep in mind about how we often think about religion and where we maybe need to expand our reaches. I very much enjoyed reading the article about gay rights, Rouse, Bishop Weakland. One thing that article shows is that religion sometimes surprises you, and religious alliances sometimes surprise us. It's one of the great things about studying religion. But the other thing, that article, in contrast with the other direct place that you all have pointed out to me that we see religion in this class, has been in Joyce's sort of reappropriation of some of the language that Bascom used about everyday morality. Joyce and Rouse would not be people who would sit well together. They represent a kind of binary, in a way we tend to think about religion as being either conservative or liberal. It's far more complicated most of the time. And that leads me to where I'm wondering where else religion plays into this class and into the Wisconsin idea. Kathy Kramer, who is one of the colleagues here I most admire, talk about values and lifestyle. But I haven't found the word religion in her work yet. I ponder that. I'd love to talk to Kathy about it. I haven't had a chance to do that yet. Do we substitute words that some of us are more comfortable with in the academy for words that people might actually use about themselves? It's worth asking about. So what I wanted to do in my little time here is open up some of those things that maybe you've seen this term, but also help you to think about maybe some things that have gone unspoken, some things you may not have seen, and some things that we ought to think about. One of them I think is quite simple. Religion is here. Forget what you've heard about. It's dead. I don't think anybody after this election can say that very thoughtfully. It's here. It matters to people. It happens in multiple ways. And sometimes the best way to see it, and here I'll get into the lived religion stuff, is not to look for it in the grand ideas of the John Bascoms, but to look for it at the kitchen tables, in the gas station diners that Kathy explores, in the cornfields, in the coffee shops of Madison, where you may not hear it in the language of sacrality, but you will hear it in the longings you hear of people who are trying to make meaning. And just want some of us in the academy to listen to them. Thanks.
While I'm doing this, I should say, it occurred to me in the spirit of the Wisconsin idea and to throw a colleague under the bus. One of the more Wisconsin idea-y things, I'll follow Corrie and what around here, that I've done in my almost a decade here is a few years ago in a performance art piece slash band project. Professor Goldberg and I were in a band that did Yiddish covers of Ramones songs. And if you want to know more about it, please speak to Professor Goldberg in detail. So this is both a wonderful and a nerve-wracking experience to be asked to talk about this, because if you didn't catch from the biography of me, I stay in the ancient world. Right, and there's some comfort in that, but on the other hand, the ideas behind the Wisconsin idea very much reverberate with me, and coming here and learning more about it, and in my, as I said, almost a decade here, I've become more and more inspired by it. And so on the one hand, I feel weird talking about it in this context. On the other hand, sitting today and trying to write up about it and then talking to my colleagues about it, and then even more so, again, I was scribbling notes on my notes, listening to Dr. Norman talk about it. It's actually a really good opportunity in some ways. And so hopefully this makes sense what I'm thinking about. I also wanted to start with sort of a reflection on religious studies. And this is sort of a wonderful and a bad thing in some ways about the study of religious studies. If you talk, as one colleague pointed out once, very few mathematics courses begin with, this is algebra, and let me explain to you the debates about the very beginnings of algebra, right? But religious studies actually begins that way for a variety of reasons, and one of the really important things about religious studies that I think very much connects to the Wisconsin idea is that people approach religion thinking it's sui generis. They think it's completely different. There's history, there's sociology, there's anthropology, and the students sort of know what to expect. But when they walk into religious studies, they either think they're trying to prove or disprove something in a way that's different than if they were to take a course on this, the First World War, or they think that this is totally different than anything else and it cannot be studied in the same academic ways. And so I think one of the big values that we bring that very much connects to the Wisconsin idea is forcing students to take those tools and apply it to something that not only do often they feel uncomfortable doing, but that many of the sources they see and interact with actually try and develop a discomfort with. And this is, again, it doesn't, I often say to my students, I don't get paid more or less whether you believe more or less when you leave the classroom. And if I did, maybe I would change things, but I do not. And you can check up state records to find that. But what happens when you consider religion like any other cultural production, like anything else? And that is a great reorientation of things because it puts things in new context. And there's the neat boxes of things, what I sometimes call the John 3:17 phenomenon, which is, how many of you know John 3:16, the verse? Okay, and I bet if I asked people could rattle it off. Would you like to rattle off, Jonathan? I'll call on you because I know you might.
For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believed in him should not perish but have everlasting life.
Thank you. Biblical literacy. I always bring a ringer in the audience. This is what Episcopalian priests are great for. But how many of you, and I'm not going to ask you, could rattle off John 3:17? Right? I see one hand, but the exception proves the rule. When people think of it, they have a neat category for it, but they don't necessarily have a full context of it or have a sense of where it all fits in. And so sometimes that's a great phenomenon to start discussing. And how do you theorize that which has been privileged in that way? And by the way, I mean that privilege too in the sense of I have students who come in and say, okay, prove to me God doesn't exist. I said, that's not what I'm trying to do. Right? Or prove to me God does exist. And I said, that's not what I'm trying to do. I just want you to read the syllabus, right? And the other thing, and I like, Dr. Norman talked about religion as a topic, but people think of religion as a discrete entity. This is religion. But actually, one of the big things we're often trying to undo is there's not necessarily a simple product that is religion as a single category. In fact, even the concept of religion as a discrete entity comes about post-Enlightenment very recently. In the Hebrew language, it's not until the Middle Ages that there's even a word that you could call religion. Right? So if there's not even a word in a language for it, to what extent would that be understandable? And this is something that really helps in thinking of, these are some of the big questions that I've always been interested in an abstract way. And then when it came to Wisconsin, I really started thinking about them even more so in a way of pushing what that value is beyond the classroom, to the extent of, I'm really now interested in 5 years down the road, how are my students going to read a newspaper? Or how are they going to read a tweet? So I say that because every now and then someone does something that's awful and wonderful for me, awful for the world, wonderful for me as a teacher. So I was going to talk about, as an email that Dr. Norman sent to me yesterday, says you're going to discuss the sifting and winnowing in the middle portion. And in regard to teaching and research, great. And I was trying to think of an example of how we do that, and then someone released an obnoxious, awful tweet that's perfectly for illustrating this. So I teach an Introduction to Judaism course, usually in the fall. Teaching it this year, I just yesterday taught about the Holocaust. And I taught about, as part of that, I introduced a concept of debates about to what extent Jews are considered white. And also, to what extent we've been talking about the definition of Judaism all semester. And we've seen that at different times in different places, different people have tried to define Jews as an ethnicity, a race, a religion for different strategic reasons. Much more complicated than to say a straightforward answer for things. And when I was teaching about the Holocaust, I asked my students, to what extent should anti-Semitism be considered separable from all other forms of racism, right? Because we've been talking about how to define Judaism, but anti-Semitism at its core is viewing Jews as a racial other. And is it a privileging of whiteness to understand that? And I said, by the way, there's this debate about to what extent Jews should be considered white, and we're going to talk about it next Monday. And then yesterday at 10:02 a.m., David Duke, in response to an Atlantic article that questioned, are Jews white? That quotes, by the way, Eric Goldstein, who's a scholar at Emory, who will be coming to Madison this summer for the Greenfield Summer Institute that Jewish Studies runs in July. If you're interested in that, I'm happy to talk to you about it, and he'll be giving a talk here that quotes him. But David Duke tweets, no, dash, and now all caps, shouting, but I won't shout, Jews are not white, exclamation point. And this, to me, was a great example of how abstract theoretical discussions we seem to have in class have real-world implications, right? My students are now better equipped to not only understand that, but to contextualize it and see that not as just a random tweet by a well-known racist, but to be able to understand all of the contours behind it, right? How has this debate played out? What is the history of it, not just in a moment, but in a long term of that? And getting them, by the way, to move, and this is a hard part for my students too, from simple yes or no answers to it depends, right? And to not just dismiss that as saying, oh, that's a crazy tweet, but to say, actually, there's a long, complicated history of that, and to think about what it does. And so a lot of times these abstract, I used to be fascinated by the abstract theoretical discussions, but one of the things the Wisconsin idea really has pushed me to do, I'll say, so sometimes I feel like I'm psychoanalyzing myself today, is to take those ideas and connect them more. To, unlike when my colleague, Professor Ridgley, will be speaking next, her research more directly connects to that in that sense. Or another headline ripped from, ripped from the headlines debate, is the debate about, as part of the run-up to the election was a discussion of registering Muslims. And I asked my students in Intro to Judaism, like, what's the question do you think I'd want you to ask first about that? And they got it, which was, well, how does one define a Muslim? which is a question that often when I start teaching Intro to Judaism, they think, well, why are you teaching it that way? This is different than anything else. And I say, well, you haven't talked to my colleagues because this is how religious studies scholars start to think. But we're beginning with some of these definitional questions. And asking those questions first is going to get you to a lot of the whys, the hows, and these questions, again, are looking at a data set that people aren't usually asking those questions of, or a data set that sometimes sets itself off to not allow those questions for. And this also gets to the question of what's at stake. So Professor Norman mentioned that she teaches one of our gateway courses in fall. I'm teaching it in spring, and I teach a religion and sexuality course. One of the big questions, so if you want to register, we still have spots. I'm always, this is what Dr. Norman has taught me, always try and plug religious studies. But I often ask my students what's at stake. And I often say, let's look at an ancient story, and let's replace a male character and a female character and see if any variable changes, right? And this is something that I do regularly with things. You can switch genders, you can switch races, you can switch anything, religions, interpretations of religion, and see how a story changes. And these are the kind of skills that I'm not just trying to teach you so that you can, ace the final, but I'm trying to teach you so that when you go into a world and interact with people, with headlines, with tweets, you have a sense of what's going on behind these things. And sometimes the more, to give an anecdote that was shockingly how interesting it was to my students, was in that class I do a whole week on menstruation. And some of the feedback I got from students was, that was great to actually be able in a class to speak about menstruation for a week. And I've learned, if you work in the ancient world, particularly with rabbinic text and biblical text, it's sort of an occupational hazard. I'm extremely comfortable discussing these sorts of things in public because there's tons of discussions about that in these ancient texts. It's just huge. It's a big deal in that. And I pointed out to students, how many of you have seen a commercial for I'll notice the language you have to change, for a feminine hygiene product, where they squirt a blue liquid into it to show you how absorbent it is. And I say, I'm not that kind of a doctor. But why does that liquid have to be blue, right? And if you look on YouTube, there are comedians who sort of make fun of that. But why? Because there's a cultural revulsion of that, and why? Right? And then that brings us back to the text. So I try and use that to say, look, when you're watching your commercials on your TV, you can still be using this analytical lens. And I always feel a victory when someone comes, I see a student like 2 or 3 years later on, and they say, I was talking to my friends in the dorm the other day, and this from class came up. But to me, that's the Wisconsin idea, right? It's not just, wow, that's interesting, I learned about ancient menstruation laws. It's, well, how does that affect a commercial I saw before the Super Bowl? And I think I want to make sure to leave enough time for Professor Ridgley, so I have other things I could say, but I will end with this point, which is on Monday, where I'm going to return to that in my Intro to Judaism class. I'm going to return to that concept of whiteness and Jews as white. And we read an article written by John Pollack, who got his PhD, who teaches at Madison College, where he talks about the history of Jews at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I love ending a class with that because I'm getting students. I've said to them all semester, you can't use we, unless you're talking about we, the students in this class. However, this last day I allow them to, because now we're talking about the history of students at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we talk about Jewish, non-Jewish students, interactions and things. We can now be introduced in ways. But the reason I love the article is there's a certain amount of public dorms here and a large culture of private dorms here. And there's become a tradition of certain private dorms more Jewish students stay in. And this article shows that this comes about from starting in the 1920s, housing discrimination, that although University of Wisconsin has this famous reputation for not having quotas on Jewish students, whereas other universities, particularly in the East Coast, had Yale had it, I think, up to 1972, had caps on the amount of Jewish students. Wisconsin did not. However, they allowed housing discrimination, that Jewish students could not stay in certain, not in public, but in their private dorms. If someone did, they would still list that, not on their website. This was the 1920s, this was before websites. I need to remind some students that. I teach a story in one of my classes that involves someone checking a phone book, and each year I feel the need to explain to students what a phone book is. It's sort of like Google in print form, only less easy to use. So, but it explains how then there became a list and a rising of certain private dorms that would allow Jewish students and not, and that eventually led to certain dorms having reputations for that and not. And so students then realizing these sort of incidental things that they kind of know but don't understand have a legacy of complications, right? And so that's one of the values I feel that connects to what we're studying. We're asking these complicated questions that, as Dr. Norman said, aren't going away, but there are the tools that we're talking about and we develop in our classes directly allow for the analyzing of these things. And so that's a good segue to Dr. Ridgley.
Okay. So I have some hard acts to follow. My colleagues apparently are very funny. This doesn't always come across in our meetings, but here we go. So I'm going to switch tacks a little bit and talk less about the classroom and talk more about other aspects of the Wisconsin idea, particularly the idea that the kind of boundaries of the classroom are the boundaries of the state and dialogue that should happen between the university and the rest of the community. As you saw in my lovely book, which is also on sale at Amazon, because we pitch things in religious studies. That's what we're also really good at, pitching our stuff.
Nebraska, right?
Exactly. Now I lost my train of thought. That's what happens when you pitch things. I am an ethnographer, and I've spent a lot of time the last, 12, 13 years talking to different folks in Wisconsin, from Green Bay down to Madison as the basic contours, to study and to think about how conservative Christians, broadly speaking, these are folks that would accept the term evangelical, as well as folks who self-identify as Christian, as Christ followers, as a whole variety of kind of terms that I will call conservative Christian, how they use focus on the family child-rearing literature. And you might know Focus on the Family or not. It was founded and headed by James Dobson for a long time and functioned as a kind of Christian clearinghouse for different kinds of materials, some of which Dobson and other people in the organization wrote, some of which they kind of gave the good Christian seal of approval. They also had and still have broadcasts on the radio, on AM or FM, often on AM stations, which means that folks who aren't attached to this movement, folks who aren't part of the movement, for a long time didn't know it existed necessarily, right? It's kind of existing in parallel to the mainstream. So my orientation in religious studies is an orientation that has to do with concern about how and why people live their lives the way that they do, and an interest in kind of understudied and undervalued voices. I was introduced as a kind of founding scholar in the study of children's voices in religion, right? We usually don't hear about children's voices and interpretations, not only in the academic study of religion, but we also don't hear about them in the public sphere. You might think, gosh, we do hear a lot about conservative Christians. We hear a whole heck of a lot about kind of evangelical movement in the country, but I would argue strongly that what we hear about is the elites. We hear about James Dobson, we hear about other elites, and the voices that are missing, the approaches that are missing, the ways of meaning-making, to go back to Dr. Norman's talk, meaning-making that are missing are what happens, how do people do that in their everyday lives for average folks, for folks in those coffee shops around town, right? How does that work out? And so I kind of want to run counter to the idea that is often discussed in our media, and I think kind of might help to lead to some of what Professor Kramer talks about in her Politics of Resentment, of saying that, oh, these folks follow their leader. And they're well aware, and you may know because you may be part of this community, right? Folks are well aware that this is the assumption of outsiders, and particularly of kind of intellectual elites. So I set about in my project to really engage and dialogue with these folks, and to use my skills as a religious studies professor, someone who's been trained in this field, to do so, right? And that means that I am trained to take seriously various worldviews and consider carefully what makes up those worldviews, and how the same word used by two different people can mean two different things, right? And it's going to take a long time for any one scholar or student scholar to come to an understanding of that. To do this project, I spent a year and a half to 2 years in a church before I ever spoke to anybody, learning the vocabulary, talking to people. What do you mean when you say this? What do you mean when you say this? What does this conviction mean? Does it mean, this is what I think of when I hear conviction. What do you mean? And kind of trying to build up a common vocabulary. So one of the things that I do in classes that we do is to talk about that common vocabulary. And that means that when I go out into the world, or when my students go out into the world, that I can talk to people, and we're not talking past each other thinking that we're saying that we're kind of sharing meaning, that we can actually come to a point of meaning. Just to say a little bit about kind of what I found in this study, was the emphasis on, for these folks, on family. And James Dobson has a very clear understanding of what that family should look like, with a father as a breadwinner, a mother as a kind of helpmeet and supporter and nurturer of the children, ideally in the home, and obedient children. When I talk to people, they affirm this, right? This is one of the reasons they liked Focus on the Family, because Focus on the Family valued family, and it valued mothers who stayed home with children, or who aimed to stay home with children, and it valued fathers who were working their behinds off to provide for their families. And it valued children who were polite and respectful, and all of those things that they felt weren't being valued in the wider world, right? That the wider world had kind of run amok. But going deeper, so if I stopped there, if that were my study, if I stopped there, it seems like all these people agree, and actually they do agree with their leader, and all of my kind of assumptions coming in have been confirmed. But when I talk to families and say, well, what does it look like? Right? What do you guys do? Or when I sat down with them for dinner, often the mom was doing the discipline, right? And the dad was doing the nurturing. And I would say, well, this looks a little different, And that mom would say, well, God gave me a great gift. And that gift was to be able to keep these kids in line. And that means that I can homeschool them, and, and we can get the things done we need to get done in the day. That's the gift that God gave me. And we're really lucky, because God gave my husband this other gift, and working together, we can show our families the fullness of God. Right? That's different than what we kind of hear in print. Alternatively, I talked to a really young, newly married, maybe they'd been married a year, new parents. They had a baby that was about 2 months old. And I said, how do you guys feel about this? You're younger, is this a generational thing? And the new dad says, well, yeah, this kind of headship thing, it's not really for me. I want a partner, I just want her to hold my hand, and we'll make decisions together, and we'll go through the world as a pair. And she looked at him and she said, that is not what we're supposed to do. There's only one thing you need to do. I do everything else, and by gosh, you're going to do it. You are going to be the head of this family. So again, if you just ask them, right, they look and they act like something you might see on TV, but underneath that, the way that this is functioning, and they're being very true to their principles here, but the way that it's functioning is very different than it would appear. So those are the kinds of things that kind of really, not just sitting with people, but really being with people in their spaces on their terms. And I think that's one of the other things, to be with people on their terms. That's one of the gifts that religious studies can and skills that religious studies can teach students and can pass on right through our scholarship to the rest of the state and to the rest of the nation and beyond, where folks in our communities can begin to see themselves reflected honestly and fully in publications out in the world. Because I think one of the things that happens, right, is that people become one-dimensional, and people become kind of to function in the service of a larger narrative that already exists, rather than kind of able to create their own narrative. And one of the things that I think both of my colleagues have talked about is how when we look at religion, we're not coming with a set definition and saying, let's jam these things in. But we're coming to a situation and saying, what are the things that matter? What are the things that are important, and how do they come together to build a worldview and to build meaning? So I think in those ways we can really contribute to the Wisconsin idea and also to our students. And hopefully, some of my students are here today, so they might call me out on this as well. But hopefully, kind of doing in-depth studies of all of these communities can help me to support students who are part of those communities, better than I could otherwise, to really understand where some of the touchstones might be, where some of the tough spots might be, that wouldn't necessarily be obvious otherwise. And when you're speaking about religion and something that people really hold most dear, it can be particularly important.